How are you?
Good, good. And you?
Yeah, also good.
Yeah, we're still in lockdown, but otherwise good.
Okay, are you in the office or are you?
In the studio, yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we're still partly in lockdown as well, but it's slowly getting relaxed a little bit.
I mean, the city has opened the last 2 days,
Mm.
people, and Mumbai being how it is, people are already back on the street. Traffic is back up, or maybe about half the amount, but that's still a lot. So it's kind of interesting to see how quickly people have just sort of bounced back, like things are, and at the same time, like cases are increasing, people have moved back. Like we've had an exodus of about 4 million people move back into the country. I mean, into the rural parts and the towns. And about 2 million have gone on foot. A little more than 2 million have, like, there are people who have walked from here to Nepal. So it's kind of just something else in terms of what's
Do you
happening.
think they will come back?
I think it's going to be for some time. I don't think so. I mean, people are going to be reticent to come back. Uh, but at some point, they will also have to come back because the workspace is primarily in the cities, and normally what the way it works, actually, the construct of how it works out here, there's always one male member or a couple of male members from a rural part that then will go to the city for work. So that's really the way it's organized. So they will come back, yeah, but I think it'll be 6 months before people start coming back in the way that it was organized before. So it's been sort of interesting to look at, how this whole situation has actually changed the entire dynamics of workspace, even just in terms of inhabitation, the city. We are a city of like 24 million, quite dense.
Yeah, and does it relieve the city a little bit, or is it not like that?
It has for the last 3 months, but having ventured out for these last 2 days, just with the automobiles and vehicles back on the street, uh, it it's quite interesting to observe how quickly that changes back to what it used to be, even if it's not in the same density. Because we're 24 million, so even if you get half the people out, that's still 10 people out on the street,
Yeah.
which is still a lot. So just, of course, that's not the case right now, but
I think there is an interesting irony that in India, maybe the poor people go back to the countryside, and in America, the rich people. Can you comment on that?
So if I heard you correctly, you said that there's an irony where people go back, the poorer people go back, as opposed to what's happening in America, where the rich people are the ones who leave the city. Correct. I think there's
And I have a further question. You don't think that in those 6 months, many of the people who went back to the countryside will find reasons and maybe ways of working that and enable them to stay?
I mean,
if they can?
Yes, optimistically, I'm hoping that that's what actually occurs. And I think part of that will happen because, just the security of being home, being on their land, again, just I'm talking about, in terms of the perception of land and space and, especially in India, just the sheer size of a population that becomes very important. Their home is absolutely critical. That's their sort of, in a sense, their sort of locus or their center. So I'm quite certain they will be inventing ways of how to stay back and create work for themselves. Yeah. I think what's happening also is now, just because of just the communication that we have now, that they would be able to work. I just had a couple of people who I have working. They just returned back, and he works in West Bengal, which is kind of on the border of Bangladesh. And I've been sort of working with the whole intention that all this, the research that I do in the studio is with the intention that they actually don't need to work here. They can actually work back from their location because all the resources are there in their location. It's just how to then proliferate it out from their locations that becomes critical. And I think that's something that I'm optimistic that's what's going to happen. But of course, cities also have work, and there's a great demand for many things within that. So there will be, I think there will be a back and forth. So within the studio, the way I've set it up now, just with everything that's going on, they come work for 4 months, they return back for a month, they come back for 4 months, they return back for 2 months, and that's how it's kind of linked in with the cycles of their holidays or very critical periods that they require to go back home. But returning back to your question, it's interesting because when I talk to them, the people that I'm working with and who've returned back, it's interesting because I asked them what they said. Their families are safe. They're in these rural parts. They don't have any problems there. And they were saying that food, clothing, and shelter is for them. It is in abundance. There's no they farm. There's enough food. There's the houses are made by them or by the community. And the only reason they come to work is because that's the exchange they require. Like if someone falls ill, to go to a hospital, to have transport, public transport. And that's the reason why they're required to make money. And the sole reason to come to cities is so that they're able to afford what otherwise they don't require in any way to support themselves. So it's kind of interesting. It's very different. And I think also the psyche of what you mentioned about what's happening in America is it's I think what I would say is the difference is the sheer density of the numbers we're talking. I mean, we're talking about here millions of people, not one, not 1,000. So I think the difference also lies in that just the sheer density and intensity of this sort of movement that has occurred.
And kind of when you did the MPavilion, you also kind of wanted to kind of give some of these insights of your research in India to Melbourne and try to provoke a discussion on that. Kind of how did you see that at the time?
Yes. I think for me, what provoked the whole idea of making the pavilion on the site was actually with the intent of in some way reclaiming some of this sort of tacit know-how. I think there's a word that describes it called lore, and something that I discovered. I think what for me was more an important point of the conversation was it's only when you ask the questions or when you begin to connect, they sort of start revealing what they know or what they're sort of holding with them or what is contained within them. And the MPavilion that I sent was actually, it's an Aboriginal structure. That's a similar Aboriginal structure that's made. The forest dwellers who have been completely displaced from the forest. And I had to move my studio of 18 years, like in 2 weeks, like with all the stuff. And I actually was on a plot of land which abutted these forest dwellers. And so I had to make a space like within 2 weeks. And I immediately went to them and said, can we put this together? And it was quite interesting. Within 2 weeks, they were able to make a sort of a space or a shelter for me. And that's actually what provoked. It was around the same time as the MPavilion tour, or maybe a little bit before that. But for me, what was interesting was, how does one provoke to draw out, cultures that have in some way, I want to use the word, it's sort of like a sediment that has settled, so the latent material still remains. It's only when through a question that sort of can emerge. So it was also with the idea to in some way engage with what was once predominantly the original culture of that place. So that was for me the sort of the preoccupation of, and that the whole idea of making that ball was to sort of connect and ground. I think for me, like fundamentally, all my work actually all originates with water. And this is something that I thought, as an interest in the idea of cities and urbanism, and something that I've reflected on for some time, was that actually culturally or sort of or in a sort of urban way, cities, let's say, formally constructed or formally, planned out. So what would be a piazza to Rome is a water tank to a city here in India. And of course, these cities now have been engulfed. They were the sort of the wellspring or where the city sort of sprang from. They continue to be used, continue to work. But that's something that, was something that I was interested, in asking was that how do what locates for you? What is what is that one thing that would maybe begin to ground a project in terms of a sort of provocation? And in your case, I did read about, the idea of the agora as a sort of gathering space, and then this idea of also place of communication. So is it a conceptual idea or is it a physical idea that
I think for the MPavilion, it was definitely kind of based on the large amount of travel to Australia for other projects, and to see that everybody is kind of engaging with society in their own way, but that there is almost no dialogue about it. That it all is taken as for granted, and nobody discusses the city because it's the best city in the world anyway, in perception of everybody.
right,
While you could kind of discuss if that actually is the case, and I think the MPavilion is trying to do that. So what we try to do is just to spark dialogue,
right,
and by making a contrast, to embed the agora in nature, which is so abundant and so important for Australia,
right,
and with the highly technical roof above it, which symbolized more or less the density of the city. I think that contradiction we try to bring in to have the dialogue. So it was definitely part of the conceptual idea but driving the dialogue was driving out the dialogue out of people, and bring them into connection was the idea. Therefore, we
But
also didn't have any boundaries.
I was going to be surprised to what extent simply creating the installation provoked the event almost spontaneously. I know there was a lot of organization, but nevertheless, it felt as if it was not only appropriated, but used very intensely exactly for that purpose, without too much artificiality or guidance.
right, right.
Yeah, no explanation was actually needed. Kind of on the first day of the opening, of course, we just simply inaugurated it, and the next day when I came to site very early, there was already in every corner things happening, which was quite interesting to see that the people wanted to have the dialogue, but they were not enabled to.
Right.
To me, it was very interesting to see it with a very simple.
Right. But I think that's also something that Naomi, I mean, when you mentioned that, it's also very, critical that the client has been able to locate a space within the city, that by having a physicality of something in there, I think these provocations are immediately sort of instigated. I mean, the same thing with the pavilion was more that just a sort of shelter in which these provocations could occur, whether they were, cultural discussions or discussions, but to kind of upend and kind of take it to a completely different viewpoint. The idea of the bamboo and the way it's tied was it sort of, in a sense, I want to call that technology too, but in a different way of how spaces were organized at some point in Australia as a sort of point of origin of just opening up that kind of communication to it.
I would like to ask the mediator. I think that we are supposed to talk also about the effects of Corona, and I am personally skeptical of all of us saying that things will never be the same and things will be extremely different and blah blah blah. I think there will be enormous pressure on things returning back to normal, and I think that if we want to use this to implement change or to try to emphasize a different direction, we will make a kind of very, very serious effort. I also want to introduce a kind of interesting anecdote. In May, early May, we had our national commemoration of the extermination of the Jews or of the victims of the Second World War. and it was celebrated in the central square in Amsterdam. And because of the Corona lockdown, there were no people, and there was only the king and the mayor of Amsterdam. And the king gave a really good speech, and at the same time, everyone thought that the emptiness was an incredible reinforcement of the message. Over a week ago, we had an event that was a protest event against the killing of black people, anti-racialism, and suddenly the same square was completely inundated with people, and there was even a scandal that they didn't maintain the 1 meter 50 distance. So in a very short time, we had two completely opposite events, and in a way, both were very much charged to Corona. But the second one seemed to really indicate that the whole idea of things changing drastically through Corona is simply partly wishful thinking, and that unless there is a very strong guidance from somewhere or collective guidance, a new situation will not really last, and that it will be very difficult to use this for new ambitions or new ideals, or to resurrect old ideas. What do you think?
No, I would second that, and it's interesting that you bring up two anecdotes, quite close together, back to back with each other. And similarly, when we started talking, was the same thing that was applicable here. Here there was a lockdown, and next thing you know, there's a gathering of people in an exodus moving in thousands, and it's in some ways similar, and at the same time, the context of how that was organized. And what I wanted to say was that Corona is just one thing right now along the way. There will be many other things like the Corona. I mean, just this idea of climate change that we're positioned, that sort of lurking behind us. So there will be other things that I think will unfold. And, this idea that how spaces to be organized, how cities need to be reshaped, or specific to a situation like the Corona. For me, I don't, I agree that where there is a possibility for it, and I think what's interesting is to take note of, the observation made about the emptiness and the density, and I think that's something which is exactly what's going to happen in Mumbai in 2 weeks. The city is going to be filled in again. I mean, every day that I go out, there are more cars, more people on the street. Just the confidence that comes back to be able to sort of venture out. So, yeah, but in the same, I think what it has done is to at least provoke the idea of how to find a bridge to provide a space for these kind of very rapid sort of changes that are taking place. And we're going to see more of, I don't think, I mean, a sort of accelerated place of these kind of shifts that are taking place. And, I think for me, just the curiosity is how do spaces or cities or organization structures provide a way to accommodate these sort of accelerated shifts that are taking place. I think that's, for me, the more important aspect. Not that there's a solution to a Corona, but that it's, or a solution necessarily to what's happening with in America and actually around the world. And it's interesting that our country, India, for example, there's been no participation in that commentary, because we have that situation in present time, between ourselves.
Yeah.
We're already confronted with that for centuries. This is what's being experienced in America right now. And it's interesting that we don't have those protests here, while the rest of the world, in Europe, in fact, even in Hong Kong, in South Korea, but we haven't had that. And that's something that has made me curious, how
Don't you also think that the contrast that you highlight, Rem, kind of will become more part of the society, where everything in the situation before Corona was simply accepted and everybody took things along? That through such a major impact, which is a major impact as a one impact, like a big flood would be on one place, and this is a big impact on the world, that people will kind of use that kind of momentum to create more contrast and more extreme points of view will come out, so that to governments to address, rather than to cities to accommodate. It's more, I think, a reason for people to now speak out, because something has happened. It was so big that now we could speak what we think is important.
Well, I wanted to kind of say that I think that there are various kind of unique parts. First of all, the entire world is experiencing the same thing. And the entire world has had a kind of very limited series of experiences. And I think that gives us collectively an enormous space for attention. And in that sense, I think it's definitely no coincidence that this event in America has such a resonance, because we have the attention kind of right now, and all of us are more or less questioning everything, questioning our own way of life, our own professional behavior, our own. So in that sense, I think it's a kind of amazing coincidence, and I would, really hope that there is a kind of way in which we can kind of mobilize this kind of same attention a little bit longer. Because not only did we all experience the kind of same emotions, but we also saw that somehow politicians were able, first of all, to act with a degree of coherence, but also mobilize enormous, unbelievable amounts of kind of money. And that if you look at our greatest urgency, which is kind of probably global warming, that basically the amount of money that they have come now mobilized is clearly enough to settle that issue. And I'm kind of wondering, what we can contribute in terms of claiming part of that money for that kind of purpose. And that level, I haven't seen a lot of action, either in our profession or in the kind of political domain.
I think it will be very possible after this has been calmed down a little bit to really discuss big topics, where before you always had to kind of discuss it locally, and the local impact was more important than the global impact. Now we have seen that the global impact of something can be so large that it locks down everything, that we maybe now can talk about it on a bigger scale. And that's also what you see now with the racism claim. You suddenly kind of, it becomes not a localized issue or around one problem. It becomes a kind of a global issue between many people. So I hope that is kind of something that the effect is, and maybe that's also the effect for cities, that we can talk about the larger context of cities again, instead of the localized development that is driven by money, but that we can also think about it more holistically again, and kind of talk about problems in a holistic way, rather than a solution on a local scale.
It sort of raises the question, and I mean, this is something that while there is this condition that I think affects us all collectively at a global scale, and this is something I'm just curious about, because it brings me back to that question of, the difference of what occurred here in the movement from urban to rural, and what happened in America from urban to rural, and the people that make that transfer. But is this, and I'm just sort of speculating that would that be something that would be needed to be taken into concern? Is, you know, how do we make things or build things? Because, you know, for example, in India, you know, buildings that are built now are basically things that are primarily exported from outside, be it, you know, glazing systems, you know, the entire construction method is a complete import. And I'm not saying that as with any judgment of it, but just something that, you know, how does one organize then within that construct where while it is where the finances maybe are something that are tapped in at more global level, but, you know, the response is something that may be more at a local level. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, maybe that's the case. Maybe kind of that there is a more global discussion that asks for particular solutions in local context. But that what you see before, or what I think you saw before, was that you saw localized initiatives and localized solutions, and never the overarching kind of idea that this was something that we had to do together, or that we all have the same issue. It was not even acknowledged that we all have the same issue. We all thought there were different issues in different parts of the world. But now maybe that kind of perception can change, that it becomes one big collective problem that needs solutions maybe on a local level, but can be organized on a global scale. Have you ever been back, Bijoy, to your pavilion after it's relocated?
Yes, I did go back when it was relocated to the zoo. Yes, I did.
And what do you think about it in that context?
I thought it was very precise in the way that they were able to actually locate the space and the way it was organized. And it's a sort of shelter for children that, you know, because the zoo has a, you know, a large footfall of young children that come there. And so it was interesting to sort of see it located in that and being used actually by, you know, it's like a rest space for them.
Yeah.
Even with their families and parents, and, you know, so it was quite appropriate in some ways.
Yeah, our pavilion was relocated to a university and kind of became kind of a dialogue space for students in the public realm.
Yes.
And I've been back twice or so, and I just sat there in the corner and see what happened. And it's really interesting that it is kind of really heavily used, not only to eat sandwiches in the break, but to also kind of really organize things. Kind of that was kind of for me interesting, that it seems that these pavilions, their afterlives, had become kind of really part of society and part of where people meet. And that maybe also is an interesting thought about it, that it was not only kind of a moment of 6 months, but that it is kind of maybe something that you can really make last much longer.
Yeah, for me, what was interesting was that there was a very careful selection, because of course one is thinking about its after use, but not with a specific place in mind, and how each pavilion has been appropriated to a sort of quite exacting location. I mean, I had the chance to see Sean Gotzel's pavilion and Amanda Ledette's, you know, both in completely different locations, and how precisely they've been sort of organized within the sort of city, you know. And Charles was in Docklands and on a corner, and they all of them work actually really well in the new context. So
it's maybe a sign that the kind of things are too over-programmed, and that the kind of luxury of pavilions is that they are not specifically programmed for anything, and that therefore they capture a need which is kind of rarely expressed. Yeah.
Yeah, it really captured a possibility, and it delivered a possibility which kind of, to me, was super surprising, because it was very different than you conceptualized it in the Victoria Gardens, but it is picked up in its new location completely, like as if it was always there, which is quite funny.